Welcome to the Think Forward podcast, where we speak with futurists, innovators, and big thinkers. Come along with your host, Steve Fisher, and explore the future together.
Welcome, friends, fellow futurists, and big thinkers. In this episode, I have the privilege of speaking with someone who has contributed a great deal to the field of foresight. I'm beyond excited to have a conversation with our guest for this two-part series. Our guest is a person who sees systems, like all of them. Technology, society, biology, you name it. He understands how the invisible gears grind behind the scenes and what it means for the future. Like he's Neo, but instead of dodging bullets, he's dodging bad foresight. In this episode, we're going to dive deep into the dynamics of systems thinking and how those systems might evolve or even dissolve into the future. Part one of this epic two-parter sets the stage, giving you a crash course in how systems work today and how we might leverage them to design a better future. So, expect fascinating insights, some laughs along the way, and as always, a healthy dose of wait, what? Moments if you're interested in how everything connects and what you can do to leverage it. This episode is for you. Welcome to part one of episode 113, The Future of Systems with John Smart. John, welcome to the podcast.
It's an honor to be here, Stephen. I love the way you think and the work you've done, your practical approach, bringing organizational foresight in, the futures and foresight practice you built at McKinsey. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, thank you for the kind words. I've been following your work for the better part of 20 years since I've been doing this as well. And, watching you become this true thought leader in the space. And what's been great for me is I followed your work all these years, but we actually only met about 6 months ago. We found quite a kinship and brotherhood in our approach, which we met. For those of you on the podcast, there's a gathering at University of Houston every year in the spring. It's called the Spring Gathering. And this next one coming up is going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the program that Andy and Peter Bishop built. So that's where we met. It's if you're a futurist or you're interested in this kind of stuff, it's such a great way. And if you can't afford to go to Dubai, this is just probably the next best thing. And I wanted to welcome John to the podcast. For those who don't know you, can you just give us a bit about your background, how you became a futurist? That would be great.
Wow. I guess I became it through just proclivity of interest in thinking about the future. It was a game I played starting at 5 or 6. One day I was bored and I started realizing, wow, the future is complicated and I can tell stories and my parents can critique them. And so they were indulgent parents, basically. Boredom and indulgent parents allowed me to start thinking about the future and trading stories. Today we call them Weeble stories. If you remember Weebles, wobble, but they don't fall down. This is a toy from the 70s. So all you millennial and Z gens. Yeah, it's an egg-shaped toy with a weight on the bottom, and you push it, and it wobbles over, and then it snaps back up. And that's what a good future story is. It's been well critiqued. And most stories about the future, a good subject matter expert will poke a hole in it and find some real problems if you widely critique it. But then it'll get back up. If the trends and the data and the models support it, it'll keep getting back up. Like all the stories we were telling about self-driving cars and computers we talked to in the 90s and the early 2000s, 20 years later, they happened because that was a Weeble story. We should have been telling that story, critiquing it, funding it. And so I started doing that as a kid. Then I went to Haas School of Business at Berkeley and started a business. Actually started 3. Third one finally did well enough that I could sell it to my partner, and I sold it to Princeton Review because they took it was science tutoring and test prep. It was all up and down California. It's called hyperlearning. So I got a really good exit, and there I was mid-career. What do I want to do next? And I went back and reminded myself of my high school passion of thinking about the future. And that's when I found the Houston program. And I joined it's the oldest, started in 75, training futurists. Oldest one, now there's 27 of them around the world, or you can get a master's or a PhD in what's called strategic foresight. And I'm sure we're going to get into what that is. But so I started there and I got a master's and started an organization, a nonprofit that was focusing on, if you go into foresight, one of my mentors, Joe Coates, the great Joseph Coates, who ran the Office of Technology Assessment for the federal government, Tech Futures Advisory by agency, that the U.S. Congress stood up to help it think about futures of technology and society and help them with policy. But he said, you got to start with a client, start with a sector, start with a client. So I started with this topic of accelerating change, which to me is one of the most interesting and neglected topics in the Foresight space, which is what things go faster every year and why, and what things go slower. And that led me to Moore's Law and Eroom's Law. Just to give your listeners an overview, Moore's Law started in 1965 with Gordon Moore, founder of Intel. And he said, in this special computing space, every 2 to 3 years, computers get twice as powerful per dollar because of this magic shrinking game there. And so you get more and more using less and less. So you get this efficiency. And then another less famous futurist said, well, yeah, that's true for this special space, accelerating digital space, but it's not true for the human space mostly. And Eroom's law, which is Moore spelled backwards, is all the things in the human space that use more and more dollars to get the same out. And the famous example started with the dollars you have to spend to get a drug through the FDA. And in 1950, the data is when it started. Every 9 years since 1950, you get half as many drugs out per $1 billion you spend. And the reason is because quality of life or the value of human life goes higher, the oversight, the regulation, the social safety requirements, because the world's more complicated. And so building a big bridge, an aircraft carrier, a new institution, anything that's complicated in the human space actually slows down the richer we get in the output, in its output. So you've got this space of the large where things are decelerating in terms of productive output and many kinds that we can measure. And that's probably a good thing in general. And then in this very special set of, let's call them the levers that are driving acceleration, this would be digital, information, and nanotech. So the growth of information, the growth of computing, the growth of sensors, the growth of digital twins, the growth of AI. And in the nanospace, things don't require a lot of oversight. In genetics, some of the fastest advancing areas of genetics, which is also nanotech, right, are going to be in agrobiotech, because you don't have the same oversight for experimenting with agricultural products as you do, say, fiddling with genes in a living organism, in an animal versus a plant. And so we've seen these pretty astounding advances in engineering yeast, et cetera, they're more like Moore's Law type things. And of course, reading genes, as our friend Ray Kurzweil said, nanopore sequencing, that's accelerating. So I learned early on that there were these kind of two futures, right? We can call inner space, which is the space of simulation and what I called at the time space, time, energy, and matter, density, and efficiency. You can localize and miniaturize critical things. You get these crazy accelerations. And then there's the outer space world where things actually slow down. And it's not only an S-curve, some of these things in the human space. It is what we call a life cycle curve. So things actually slow down, saturate, and they hit a peak. And then they go down further. And so pollution, climate change, human population, use of critical resources, all of those, we're actually in what I call an age of peaks. We're very close to peak car globally because people just want to use these transportation networks. We hit peak steel in 2010 because our recycling is so good now around the world that we're digging less iron ore out for the whole species than we used to. Other things, aluminum, we got to recycling earlier. Plastics, we're going to get to. We're going to actually hit peak plastic at a certain point where peak oil demand is within sight. Some people said we actually have hit it, but others have said no, it's probably within the next 5 to 10 years. because we're doing this massive electrification. So we're going to leave, just like we left coal in the ground, right? A lot of oil in the ground.
That I was going to, before I get into the work as a futurist, well, the interesting talk about these peak, what did you call them?
Age of peaks.
Age of peaks. Doesn't there also, what would be the impact of maybe a larger shift into another type of, I don't know, exploration in space or another type of industrial shift that would cause the peak to then move further, right? It's if I don't need, we've gotten it optimized for steel or aluminum, but if we're going to build a lot of rockets.
You meant here. And this argument goes back to, so my interest, as you may be able to see here, is big systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I started with understanding acceleration, and then I moved into understanding adaptation, how complex systems adapt, right? And so I think there's two major things going on. There's evolutionary exploration, and there's developmental optimization. And we think of our own bodies as a perfect example. We have our children. I'm holding up my left hand right now, and my fingers are spreading out. And this is what evolution does, right? In living systems, evolution explores. So this is Darwin's tree of life, right? What you can say about the future is, apropos to what you just said, constant experimentation. And there's going to be new areas where you're going to get this diversification and acceleration. And then, but that's always balanced in a living system by, I'm holding up my right hand and I'm spreading my fingers out and reading left to right. It's not a tree that's expanding in a developmental system. Development is taking all the chaos and diversity out of a system and hitting a future target with high predictability. So you've got unpredictability and And so from a physicist's perspective, the universe is an unpredictable, predictable system. It's such a crazy paradox. What's predictable, obviously, is the laws of physics, laws of chemistry, laws of biology, laws of society. We were just talking off pod about these secular cycles. And Peter Turchin's work with Cleodynamics, perfect example. Carlota Perez's work, Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, her book on that, perfect example of these highly predictable, large-scale cycles in the complexity of the system. That is not an evolutionary signature. That is a developmental signature. So when you say psychological development, economic development, social development, planetary development, you're using the D word and you're talking about the predictable features, or let's call them probabilistic features, right? And then, but at the same time, you have to talk about all the possibilities and all the new emergent levels. So I would argue that's a super long response to your question of where does the next explosion happen? If human reproduction is peaking, I would argue the next explosion is in digital minds, robots, sensors. It's going to be these digital quasi-living organisms that also are replicating, evolving, and developing, but they're using less and less resources in every replication cycle. This is the really interesting thing about accelerating change. Because of this STEM density and efficiency we talked about, see, our children are going to use the same resources in replication as we do, or even more, because they have more abundance, they have higher goals. Digital and technological systems do not do that. The critical ones, the ones that lead, they dive into this interspace world. That's why quantum computing is so much more crazily efficient than classical computing. So if you can figure out how to take a process in your organization and localize it or miniaturize it, you're using this STEM density, right? You're using these tools. That's why cities totally outcompete the urban environment. That's why corporations and their supply chains totally outcompete the previous loose federations that people used before they had supply chains and containerization and all those things. So that is we call that densification of the world, right? Density is beating sparsity. But the other thing we learned in our Acceleration Studies Foundation as we were studying this is there's this other term, dematerialization. What is also happening with this digital acceleration is not only are we densifying, localizing and miniaturizing wherever we can, we are dematerializing a lot of processes in our world, things we really care about, in two ways. We're either digitizing, which is creating information that measures the physical world and can start to substitute for it, or simulating, which is the process of taking a goal, taking a value, taking an objective, and creating a model that we can explore in what we call fast space, totally outcompete slow, expensive, risky, simple outer space with fast, efficient, more conscious, more deeply able to both explore and predict inner space. And that's what the human consciousness is. It's the most densified and dematerialized thing that we know of in our universe, certainly on Earth, right? It's incredibly, deeply a simulation machine, more than anything else. 3 pounds of this very special electromagnetic structure that's thinking at 100 miles an hour with 80 trillion unique synaptic connections inside of between each of our ears. There's nothing as complex as that on the dematerialization side. And that's why human foresight, applying our thinking to where we want to go next, using brains, educated, supported, optimistic, motivated individuals, totally outcompetes any other process of looking ahead. That's why democracies outcompete autocracies long-term, because in network theory, autocracies have to deny power and simulation capacity down the hierarchy, whereas democracies are creating this amorphous network where each system is both cooperating and competing, so it has much more capacity to simulate as a network, right? What we're going to talk about is this idea that individuals, organizations, and networks are the 3 fundamental ways complex systems adapt, right? And so this process, this democratic process that we use in the West, long-term, I would argue, is way more adaptive than an autocratic process like we're starting to see in China. And we saw, of course, for the longest time in communism versus capitalism in our parents' era in the Cold War. So I think that these are like super useful. These big picture models are super useful for helping us get an intuition for what's most adaptive for us. So as an organization, I want to be thinking about my individuals. I want to be thinking about my group, my organization as a group with shared norms. But then the fusion of those two is I'm embedded in a network with unique individuals and organizations who are both competing and cooperating. So what's my network strategy? How am I building the network, or we call in the tech space, the platform, right? All the platform plays by the tech titans, what we've seen in the last 20 years, certainly since the iPhone was invented, platform plays totally crushing the individual and the group strategy. It's the network strategy. How can I be, if not I'm in the center of that hub, how can I be one of the critical hubs in this digital network that's emerging? And so intangible value, my friend Kartik Gata, the venture capitalist, he says intangible value. What is the intangible value you're creating in the network with your strategy? And does everyone else in the network see it and use it? That just totally outcompetes the tangible space, because that's really last generation.
You had mentioned a lot of things in this excellent kind of breakdown of the nature of systems. You had Acceleration Studies Foundation for a long time, the ASF, which you mentioned, which is now the Evo Institute. But that leads us to a lot of what you've started to talk about with systems is evolutionary development. Many people might have heard the term, but they don't really know what it is. And I think explaining that, connecting that to what you've just shared, and the ability to take those concepts as it relates to also doing foresight and futures work, and then giving people a grounding in that with what you just shared with systems. We're about to take a new leap. I call it a new age, I think, in humanity. Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit on that? Like what your work is around that?
And I'll try and do it from the perspective of kind of the strategist.
That would be great, because I think there's going to be people listen, some are scientists, some are researchers, many strategy people listen to this podcast. obviously many futurists, but people in innovation functions, in strategy functions, in product functions. I think how does it relate into that? You should go through the explanation relating to their work. Because they'll look at it as theory, but it is also as their application, right?
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Yeah. In my book, I wrote a book, it took me 6 years with a team in my little consultancy, Foresight University, which is an arm of Devo Institute. Is we realized that early on that the great Alvin Toffler got to these ideas, the 20th century futurist, who many people still have his books.
Well, he's what started me on my journey when I was 13.
Yeah.
I read Future Shock when I was 1984. And I was like, oh, you could do this as a job? Yeah. No, it really did change my life. And I was a science fiction fan, and I read a lot of hard science fiction.
Awesome.
People listening to the podcast know that about me, but his work with his wife, and I think Heidi doesn't get it recognized as much.
You totally upgraded my Sam, or what I should have said. I should have said the great power couple, Alvin and Heidi, because Heidi did all of his research. Heidi did all of his critiquing. She took his stuff and she would bleed red ink all over it. And that's one of the central themes I realized. And I was looking for fundamental models in this book. It took me 6 years to write it. I didn't start it until I was almost 18 years into my work as a futurist, my second career, basically. And I'd finished my master's at Houston in strategic foresight. But I wanted to put fundamental models down. And so my book is called Introduction to Foresight. And it's really aimed at students, but not just students in these 27 academic programs, but students who consider themselves autodidacts, students of life. A lot of our great leaders, a lot of our great strategists, we're constantly learning, just-in-time learning.
Pointing in my head like that. Yeah, that's for those of you, I think, on this podcast, are probably the default. You may not even know the term. If you're a lifelong learner and you always pursue knowledge, irrespective of a degree pursuit, but just the fact that you just want to learn. There's always things to learn.
Totally, bro. My book is aimed at those people, which is all of us, really, because it turns out that learning, foresight, action, and review, this is called the LFAR loop, is actually built into human psychology. So in the last 10 years, there's been this whole psychology of foresight field that has emerged. I quote a lot of the studies in my book, and that is the psychologists who are saying, how do we actually look ahead? And first we learn, which means we look at the past and the present that's relevant. Then we look ahead with foresight, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then we act, and then we review. And all of us do this. And some of us are a little stronger in one set of steps and weaker in the others. I'm strong in learning and foresight. I don't necessarily act and review as much as I should, particularly review. But the better I get at following that loop, it's called the do loop, the higher the quality of my foresight.
The do loop, not the doom loop.
No,
just
the
clarify.
The do loop.
The DO loop.
Yep. And we actually coined that term 6 years ago, off of John Boyd's OODA loop, if you know what that is. Those of you in the military community, observe, orient, act, review. Observe, orient, decide, act, OODA. And Boyd's, and then of course there's the predictive processing loop in psychology. There's the design thinking loop. There's the agile development loop. There's the action learning loop. There's the scientific method. Observe, hypothesize, experiment, and look at your results. These are all these 4-step loops. The Deming quality loop, plan, do, check, adjust. All of these loops happening at different speeds are just do loops. And so we realize, okay, that's a fundamental model we have to get across to people in this book. And another one we got across is, to your question, what are the fundamental processes of foresight? Toffler got them in Future Shock. In the last third of the book, he said, science of foresight that's emerging. There's an art of foresight that'll always be there. So the science emerges from the predictable aspects of the universe. The art of foresight is all of the creative ways we deal with the unpredictable and uncertain. And then sitting on the top is a fusion of art and science is the preferable future, the politics, the strategy, all the fights that we have, over what we want. And so this was his 3 Ps model. And then Roy Amar at the Institute for the Future, really famous, he coined Amara's law, which is we underpredict for exponential processes. We underpredict in the long term. We overpredict in the short term. We think everything's coming right away. So this is also called we mistake a clear view for a short distance.
I remember back in 1998, Palm pilots were out. The era of mobile is coming, and it came from a good, 10 years, 20
Right.
years. It was
Exactly.
always coming tomorrow. And
Always coming. Yes.
Yeah.
And then if you want, so I quote about 500 books in my book. My book is for people who like to skim books, and I have a 4-page handout here that helps you figure out, helps you with the habit of skimming a book a week, if you'd like to do that, and creating a little summary on the inside jacket of the things that were most cool to you. Build your own personal index, and then teach that to somebody else in a 5-minute Ignite presentation. And if you have people on your team doing this once a week, and then you have your Brown Bag Fridays where everybody's giving you a pitch on what they learned in the time it takes to watch a movie. That's the time that, call it interval reading or sprint reading. So if you sprint through a great book and you create this subset of things that really interested you, and you go right to the index and circle 10 things you've never seen before, and you go right in and you read those, and any one of those that looks interesting, you created a little index, and then you pitch it to others. Suddenly you have what's called GIGO, which is, we may all remember if we coded in college like I did, garbage in, garbage out. But it's the flip of that is great inputs give great outputs. And so the psychology of foresight tells us that within 48 hours after we read some high quality thing, our thinking quality is actually elevated, because all of that information is not in long-term memory. It's still in what's called the cram window, which is the short-term memory. That's why we cram for tests and we totally outperform if we don't, right? Anything you have seen, experienced, thought about in a 48-hour window sits in an area of your brain called the hippocampus. And it has so much more capacity to hold interesting things. And then while you're sleeping at night, you write a subset of that to your cortex, to long-term memory, but only a subset. And you have GIGO. If you're watching something, talking to someone, skimming something that's super high quality once a week, that for the next 2 days afterwards, your thinking is so elevated. What are the key books that you want to think about? Because books are the most complex single information structure that we share with each other today. Yes, articles are great. Podcasts are wonderful. Books are like the top of that pinnacle. If you can, like your startup equation, if I can skim that book, I will get so many frames in my head for critical things, critical models, critical systems I have to balance. And if I'm actually going to create some output with that, then suddenly the quality is that much higher. And so I realized how important that LFAR loop was, the to-do loop, right? Learning, foresight, action, and review. And so in my appendix of this book, I've got a foresight skills journal that applies about 6 of these fundamental models that you can read through and decide, am I using this on my team? Where am I strong? Where am I weak? I put it up on my website, foresightu.com/pubs.
We'll put that link in the show notes too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's the first. It's the first thing on that page, foresightu.com/pubs. Skim it. At the very least, skim the first chapter, which is the executive summary, and this workbook at the end, this skills journal, and ask yourself, hey, am I using these tools? Because now we're going to get to Toffler's model, which is, I think, the second most fundamental model after this loop that we all use.
Before you hit Toffler, the one thing I want to interject is you talked about sprint reading. The startup equation for those, it's a book that Janae, Dwayne, and I wrote, Dr. Dwayne, and I wrote 8 years ago on startups. We're going to redo a second edition, but I use what's called retrieval reading, because it's designed to basically, if you want to build a company, but it's got all the sections and pieces. If you're doing a team culture, you can go through it. But if you want to be able to pull that out, I like the sprint reading concept because you could sprint through it. But there's also, I call it retrieval reading. So you want to go back and pull something out versus a larger, like a biography, things that are just meant to be consumed in a linear fashion. You want to be able to go back, right? So
so trying to actually build a mental model, right? When we're reading. That's the most valuable long-term. What is the model we're building and how conscious are we of building it? So key. Yeah. So one of the hacks I mentioned is after you finish building your mental model, your index on the inside front cover, put the book in a pile to be shelved. Don't shelve it yet. Put it in a pile. And then at least a week later, let it age fine wine, right? And then a week later, pick it up, look at that index and decide which pieces of those ideas, things I might do, people I might talk to, things I want to research, people I want to look up on the web. I've got these 8 codes that you can put on the inside of your jacket, right? Look at those a week later because only half of them now are you still going to want to do because it's gotten out of your short-term memory. And now it's more related to what are your longer-term passions, goals, projects, and then take a subset of those, put them in your to-do list or your journal, your day planner, and then shelve the book. And then if it calls to you when you're sleeping, the way I'd present it, you're going to need to pull that book down, read it again, go through it, maybe even read it old school, cover to cover at that point. But what I've found is really only a small subset of these amazing books do I really have time or the interest to do that with. Mostly what I want to do is get Geico. I want to get high quality summaries. And then I get better. When I'm skimming a book, I read the table of contents. I could read the first and last page of some of those chapters and say, oh, this is a chapter I have to read at old school. But the other ones I can let go.
When you think about this book, and there's other books out there in the field, we talked about the motivation, the L4 loop. They have a 4 horizons model, but what I want to do is relate to 4 horizons around getting people excited about foresight in an organization, getting people to read. It's one thing to have a book club and do a sprint read, but like bringing foresight into an organization. You and I talked about this before the start of recording, as I'm big on the organizational foresight and how do you create futures literate people, futures fluent, that it becomes part of culture, right? How do you get, personally for you, how do you get people excited about it? And let's relate that to the roles. So let me start this. So I was sharing this. So you have the product officers, the innovation officers, the strategy officers, teams. When I explain to people where this fits is the product officers have a horizon of about 18 months. They look at the product, they look at what's coming, the roadmap, the customer feedback, the things that you do to make the product successful because it's what makes the company money. Beyond that, there's the innovation officer who is managing a portfolio of investments, just like a venture capitalist. They're making investments in new ideas, whether they be core or adjacent, transformational, tangential, whatever terms you want to use. They do eventually feed in and become product teams if they're successful, or they become new businesses, spin-offs, new ventures, and so forth. That's about a 3-year horizon. Then there's the strategist, which kind of goes along the whole band, but they have to look out farther. And that's where foresight and futures work comes in, which has always been surprising to me that it became not an acceptable practice in many places because it's not. Strategy is more almost reactionary and almost forecasting. And we talked about, if we can, the kind of, we'll call it the split, the camps, the forecasting camp and the futures camps. When you meet with clients, like how do you talk about the use of foresight in an org with that kind of grounding, and how do you get them excited?
This is really a good place to actually present some of the most interesting work from the psychology of foresight. Gabrielle, starting in 2010 at NYU and the other university in Berkeley, or in Germany. She started working with students, and then she worked with lay people. And she did these randomized clinical trials, the gold standard in research. And she had people think optimistically about the future and then make a plan. And then she observed their action and reviewed what they got done and their prediction of what they would get done. And then she had them think negatively about the future, pessimistically, and then make a plan and then act. And she reviewed that. And then she had people think optimistically and then pessimistically and then make a plan. And then what she called reverse contrasting. Think about all the risk and then think about the positive goals and then make a plan. She measured 3 things. She measured how much they got done, how accurate their prediction was of what they would get done, and their motivation to overcome an obstacle that she had not anticipated. And what she found, and this is in her book, Rethinking Positive Thinking, which is mentioned in my book. And the title basically means don't just be a positive thinker, be a positive and a negative thinker in the right ratio, and then make a plan. That was her big insight. Positive psychology is missing, really should be called positive negative psychology. Because what she discovered was if you go negative first and then positive and then make a plan, 50% less of what you're going to get done, what's actually going to happen, and you get 50% less done. And this is over any time horizon. This is over your daily worker's horizon. This is over your product manager's horizon. This is over your innovation officer, your strategist horizon, over any horizon. She started with things like how many SAT words or how much reading can a high school kid get done prior, where they do this visualization, positive, negative, plan. And in the positive, they're thinking of that, oh boy, they're actually imagining I got it done. What are the benefits? What are the advantages I have of getting that done? What are the new freedoms I have, the new capabilities? Then they have to spend the same amount of time thinking of all the ways they're going to predictably fail based on past behavior, based on past known aspects of themselves. And then they make a plan. It has at least one if-then statement. If this problem comes up, then I'm going to do this. Call in a friend. I'm going to take a short break and make sure it's no longer than 5 minutes, so I get right back to what I have to do, whatever it is. And that if-then statement helps with motivation, even for unanticipated obstacles. And so what we realized when we read her stuff was that's part of this pyramid. It's actually an Evo-Devo trapezoid. You remember those in high school where you had to do, a trapezoid is like a pyramid with the top chopped off.
Mm-hmm.
So the bottom, what you have when you're assessing the environment, and this is for yourself, for your team, for your whole organization, over any time horizon, you're going to have a conversation. You're actually going to have a conflict in your head between relevant knowns and relevant unknowns, between developmental predictability and evolutionary unpredictability, knowns and unknowns. You're going to have that fight. What's relevant to my environment? Then you're going to move up to strategy. And this is where we all care. We don't care about the environmental assessment in most of the schools of thought and foresight. But I'm arguing it's really wherever it's the grounding. And you've done that homework. Then you move up to what's my optimistic vision? What's my defensive threat vision? And we have to balance those two in strategy. And all of our great strategy is optimistic possibilities. It's called strategic optimism in the psych literature. And then what are the things that could take that vision down? That's called defensive pessimism in the psych literature. It's not explanatory pessimism, which is the whole world's going to crap. It's defensive pessimism. You're only being pessimistic around in relation to the vision. So you have to force yourself to create a shared vision if you're on a team, or an individual personal vision if you're thinking about what I'm going to get done today or in my time box. And then she says you got to fight yourself with the negative thinking right after it. And think a little bit of what might not work. Then make your if-then statement with if this problem, then this. And then she also argues, and her husband argues this, great motivational psychologist, we're giving his name right now, key resources. What are the key resources that are going to help me? So not just if then, what are my key resources I want to make sure I get this done? And what she found in all these randomized clinical trials is you get 30 to 120% more predictive accuracy, what you're going to get done today, this week, next quarter, and 50 to 150% more output. And then if you hit an unanticipated obstacle, and her measurement was more squishy on this one, you persist longer. Your motivation is higher to figure out a solution because you've already anticipated one type of problem. And so you get this prediction, productivity, motivation. you get this trifecta because you've had the strategic conflict at the top. We call it sentiment contrasting. And you've had this predictive conflicting at the bottom. And this gets to one of the big issues in our field. Our field historically in the 50s started with a balance between predictive and unknowns, exploring unknowns, wrestling with uncertainty, and predictive trends. You may recall this, but the start of professional foresight was the funding of Rand Corporation in 46, in 47. These think tanks that did huge trend analysis. So this gets to, again, what does our strategy team want to do? It wants to do, on the predictive side, trend analysis, probabilistic models, prediction markets, causal models, sentiment contrast or sentiment mapping. What do the experts say we can predict regardless of strategy? If we do all that on the probable side, then we are actually equipped to do all of this. We're anchored. We're equipped with that expected. It's often called the expected future because it also includes like what top management thinks is going to happen, which may be fantasy, but we have to include that because we can predict they're going to act on their expected future, even if it's wrong. So we have to learn how to guide them away from that, right? So we have that. We've done that work. Then we do possible side, all the stuff that our field really has been about since the 70s and 80s, which is
before you do that, before you jump there, is for those like listening, it was a really good clarification is the strategists go with the known knowns. All the things that they do, extrapolate out the unknown. COVID's a good example of this, a pandemic. How many did simulations for how they would reorganize? We all saw that. I don't have to recount that, but it was a disaster in many cases. And some haven't learned. But think about it.
Learned and some didn't. Right. Exactly right. Yeah.
The strategy organization in its function is not futures thinking. And this leads back to what you were just about to get into, where the fields went and where things go. What I want to get to is how do we bring that back? How do we get back to that? Because think about Herman Kahn. There could be nuclear war, but there's a lot of unknowns. What happens if this? What happens if that? They were dealing with both, and that grounded
in a balanced way,
right?
So, and the International Institute of Forecasters (IIF) split off from World Futures Society in the 70s. Might have been late 70s, because the futurists were not recognizing this pyramid. They weren't recognizing Toffler's pyramid. And even though Toffler and Amara had told that to them, to be fair, Amara didn't tell them the 3 Ps were this universal way of thinking until 81 in his seminal article in The Futurist. But Toffler said it in 70 in Future Shock. People had a lot of hints that you have to balance the knowns and the unknowns before you have the strategic conversation. And what you can do, and then when you're doing the strategic conversation, you have to split them into the visions and the risks. So we call this the cover model, KUVR, knowns and unknowns at the bottom, environmental assessment, and then visions and risks at the top, where the optimists and the pessimists have to thrash it out. And so you have to cover your bases, KUVR. You got to cover your bases in the process of creating great strategy. And one of the most obvious things, and this is in my appendix, is that different people like different corners of those two conflicts. Certain people just love different corners. And now we have the forecasters and the science folks and a lot of the statisticians and the sociologists and stuff and the psychologists, they're on the knowns side. Then we have a lot of the creative and design thinking and alternative futures, right? On the evolutionary side. And then the mix of those two, the Evo-Devo on the top of this pyramid, is going to, again, break into the people who want to start with visions, people who want to start with risks. And one of the things that was discovered is a very powerful thing. You ask in any organization, any strategy organization, how many of you start with things that are going to bite you, the things you need to fix, and you're thinking about the future? And how many start with the opportunities and how I want to get them? And it's almost a 50-50 split in most organizations. Now, in some, like in defense, which is one of my primary clients, the defensive thinkers are going to outnumber the opportunistic thinkers like 2 to 1 minimum. In law enforcement, same thing. Probably in any what's called an HRO, high reliability organization. So this would be air traffic control, this would be space exploration, anything where the cost of error is really high. And so a lot of their problems is they don't do enough creative exploration. They don't do enough experimentation. They don't do enough innovation because they really have to protect. So we can rename that pyramid of the 3 Ps into the 3 mandates. 3 mandates are: we want to create, that's evolution. We want to protect, that's development. And we want to adapt, and that's evo-devo. The mix, adaptation is always a mix of creation and protection. Unpredictable, predictable.
And that, my future forward friends, is just the beginning of our journey into the world of systems with the brilliant John Smart. We've only scratched the surface. So if your mind is buzzing with new ideas, hold on to your seat, because part 2 is where things really take off. Next time, we'll dive even deeper into the future of systems and explore how they shape everything. You don't want to miss it. So make sure you're subscribed and get ready for part 2 of the future of systems, because the future's coming and it's got some wild surprises in store. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Think Forward podcast. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms and at www.thinkforwardshow.com, as well as on YouTube under Think Forward Show. See you next time.